All right, we're live. So welcome to the LSVW, first one of 2016. Thanks for joining us. So today we're going to be here talking about a paper by Christian Grose and Jordan Peterson. I got the authors' names wrong, I see now. So Jordan Peterson and Christian Grose, called The Private Interests of Public Officials, Financial Regulation in U.S. Congress. And we are joined by several excellent discussants, panelists here. So I'll let them introduce themselves before we get going.
Okay, should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm Chris Witko at USC East, University of South Carolina. Glad to be here. Sorry I was late.
No problem.
I'm Ellie Powell of the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Thanks. Jason.
I'm Jason Roberts, the University of North Carolina.
I'm Nate Monroe, University of California, Merced, and our authors.
I'm Jordan Peterson from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles.
And Christian Grose, the University of Southern California.
Okay, thanks. So we're going to, as is our custom here, we're going to turn it over to the authors for a few opening remarks, and then we'll sort of work through the paper. The typical fashion is sort of to invite first some introductory or framing comments from the discussants, and then we usually talk then about theory issues, and then research design, and eventually sort of data and empirical issues. Of course, we end up bleeding over in both directions, so that's fine, and we're welcome sort of back and forth. If you if you want to sort of jump in or offer sort of your general take on things at any given point, you just sort of raise your hand, and I'll try to call on you or keep track if you're sort of getting in line. If you have something that you want to jump in on real quick, you can kind of sort of put your fingers up like this or like this to let me know that you have something really quick to interject that you don't want to wait your turn for. And other than that, we're sort of we'll work through and then have a bit of a free-for-all. Hopefully, give lots of good feedback to Christian and Jordan. So, guys, you want to go ahead and give us some introductory comments, just whatever you like about sort of introducing us to the paper.
Yeah. So this paper, it's generally about the financial interest of members of Congress, what the and how that might influence public policy making. And we have a few cases that we're examining in the paper. We're particularly interested in feedback on the paper, obviously, but other ideas going forward, because we've collected quite a bit of data on personal financial holdings of members of Congress.
Yeah, so I'm just to build on that briefly, it kind of fits in with my larger research interests also, which include not just how the financial interests of members of Congress might impact their policy-making decisions, but also how members of the federal bureaucracy might also have financial interests that are related to their decision-making. And as you'll see in the paper, we'll talk about later, there are kind of different expectations that we have based on the underlying asset allocation. So I'm looking forward to hearing comments and talking through it.
Okay, thanks, guys. Okay, so we'll open up with generally comments from any of the discussants that want to sort of jump in. Comments on some of the framing issues. Any sort of big picture comments or suggestions for our authors. So, Chris, Ellie, Jason, Chris, why don't you start us off?
First of all, let me say I like the project. It's really interesting. On the framing, I think there's a real tension between your focus on kind of the personal financial interests of members of Congress versus risk aversion. And in some places that's a little bit confusing, which one you're really testing. So I just think you could do more to make that clear up front, kind of which you're interested in, which is ultimately both. And then I have some more comments on how you might kind of tease those differences out, but we can talk about that in a little bit.
Okay. Ellie or Jason?
Sure.
Go ahead, Ellie. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Jumping
Jason.
on what Chris said, I think
you could work on that a little bit, because I think if I told someone today that I read a paper and the takeaway from it was that people who are in a position to do things to benefit themselves do so occasionally, people will be like, oh wow, that's exciting. People do things for their own personal gain. It almost seems like you're trying to, in places, make an argument that there's something about the fact that you might have members who are risk acceptant, going after personal gain that could be somehow catastrophic to the economy, the country, etc. That doesn't come through up front. I mean, maybe that could be a frame, is that you essentially have people who don't know a lot about the financial system, perhaps, who are very risk acceptant, maybe because they're in politics to start with, are potentially gambling with the country's future. And this is why I should care about this. So you could develop that hook a little more up front, rather than just say, somehow there's just not a lot of tension there for me to think that members might vote for their own personal interest.
Yeah, I think picking up on what both Jason and Chris have said, I think teasing out the sort of difference between, there's a little bit of a tension between both the sort of financial self-interest and the risk acceptance, but also the extent to which they're aware of the risk acceptance that they're taking, like the extent to which that they sort of realize the risk inherent in the strategies that they're producing, like how much of this is about sort of personal financial literacy, or like understanding about the way the markets work. Like you guys don't seem to really take an explicit stand on the extent to which these members are deliberately sort of pursuing strategy, like wealth acquisition, or either self-interested or for the country strategies that involve a substantial amount of risk, versus how much they think that the risk is non-existent, or like, I think you've done a reasonable job of sort of teasing out what implicit risk acceptance they have, but the sort of member awareness of it side seems a little less developed. Sort of the other thought I had about the framing is, I think right now the paper is framed in a way to be about sort of to what you can explain the financial bubble and you can explain the sort of fiscal collapse, and I would sort of back away from that frame just a little bit, just because so many things went into the financial collapse, and you're sort of looking at one contributing factor, but I don't think you want the paper to hinge on whether or not these policies were the things that led to the financial collapse or not. That sort of, to me, is a slightly different paper, so I might just tone that language down a little bit and sort of tease out some of these other questions a little bit more.
Yeah, can I also jump in on one other point? I think you make the point that party and ideology don't really explain voting on these financial regulatory matters very well at one point or maybe a couple of points, but I think if that's true, make that point very clearly up front with some data. X percentage of votes are determined by party on financial issues compared to other issues, and then what's going on if it's not party and ideology, which are obviously the dominant explanations of most votes these days anyway.
One other thing that it seemed like you could have done, I especially echo, I think, Ellie's point about, I like the sort of hook as like a real broad, big picture, in what ways does this affect the world, but not as a reason to not as a sort of, so the financial bubble is sort of one of many potential implications of thinking about kind of risk aversion and financial interest. I guess if I was going to sort of try to fill the void that would be left by taking some of that frame away, one direction I'd be tempted to go in is grabbing some of the sort of argument about personalistic vote or personal personal personal, I'm using the wrong word, private interest. So like Rhodey, some of his stuff from the early 90s, not parties and leaders, but like he has a book, or he has an article in the Senate, a book chapter, and some other things where he talks about private interests, and like Van Houweling more recently talks about private interests. And the interesting thing about thinking about it that way is that I think in those treatments and in other similar treatments that talk about private interests, mostly people think of those as being quickly supplanted by other things, right? Like they quickly rank third behind party pressure and constituent interests when they diverge from those things. One of the interesting parts of the story, if you really want to talk about financial issues and deregulation, would be to say, you know, if you could make the argument that when personal financial risk or personal financial interests are in play as the driving motivation for a private interest, constituency or party concerns less easily overtake those things, right? And that's a much more perverse story, right? So that if I have a private interest as a legislator where I just happen to be really pro-choice, but my party or my constituency begins to lean or has always leaned pro-life, right? That ideological interest might be buried. But if it's my personal wealth, right? Those things don't as easily bury it. So I like that from a sort of purely theoretical framing standpoint about where to enter into the literature.
Okay, good. So should we comment now?
Yes, please.
Okay, so yeah, those are all great comments. We struggled with the risk aversion versus personal interest and exactly what to emphasize, and also maybe there's separate papers, one about risk aversion, one about personal interest, but they do tie together in this particular case. I do think the private interest is the way to go. It's about private interest trumping other factors that are very common in congressional decisions.
Yeah, and I think going forward, I think creating some sort of, I don't know if it would be a composite measure, or at least kind of a composite theoretical expectation about how members, either risk aversion or risk acceptance, comparatively might be related to whether or not those members are more willing or kind of more primed to act on their own underlying, more direct assets that are facing some kind of implication based on either regulation or deregulation.
And other than that, so I do find, I know Jason, you said it's not that surprising. I still find it interesting that they're voting in their interest. If they own a stock, they're voting for a bill that will help that stock, at least in some of the cases that we look at. Even though it's obvious, it isn't that surprising necessarily, but it's still, when it is framed as their private bottom line versus, usually we frame private interest in the literature as interest groups, campaign contribution, subverting constituency interest or other more broad interests. And in this case, it's, the personal private interest of the legislator themselves is pretty meaningful, but we could probably work on making that case.
Yeah, I think you can build up that angle, that the personal views and interests and preferences of these people due to their, there's been a lot of recent literature, even the Washington stuff on that legislators with daughters are more likely to favor abortion rights and things like that. So you can build that angle up more, I think.
I would also think about playing it up in terms of setting up the foil of the conflict of interest rules with regard to the House and the Senate, and sort of talk about, I don't know exactly what they are, but I'm pretty sure that they exist, and sort of you could play out that language about whatever the rules are about when they're supposed to recuse themselves. And remember, some senators and presidential candidates set up these blind trusts and put their assets in blind trusts specifically to avoid this problem. And so you could throw in a couple of examples of that, of sort of like the ideal type of how they're supposed to handle this situation, and sort of walk back from there. I was going to bring this up in the empirical section, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I was looking at the CQ Almanac, the big monster volume, and I noticed this. I was actually noticing this and doing something unrelated a couple of weeks ago, that in their codes for how members voted on something, one of the codes that they offer is a code of C, voted present to avoid possible conflict of interest. And it's been on my to-do list for a while to look into do any of them actually do this, and when, and what are the rules. In skimming these handful of pages before now, I didn't find anyone who would actually use that code, and I've never seen anyone write any papers about that code or as a procedure. But it'd be pretty cool to sort of talk about what the origins of that rule would be and who used it and when, and theoretically, probably by the rules of the House, anyone who explicitly owns stock in Ford or whatever should have recused themselves. I mean, I don't know what the rules are, but it seems like you could look that up and sort of set yourself up a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit of a strong man, but at least in terms of rules of the House of how they're supposed to behave.
Yeah, I think. Do you know what the rules were before the Stock Act? So you know the Stock Act was passed where they're more explicit the recusal laws, and that's what I'm most familiar with. But it's not particularly strong, and I think I mean one thing we're trying to argue. I like the idea, by the way. Before I say this, I think we should look at who's recusing themselves because there are some very explicit ones. Like if you own city stock, you had an explicit interest in those late '90s votes. But there's so many things they should actually recuse themselves from if they're following this strictly in a way that would be nearly impossible because so many of them own a significant number of stocks in certain sectors, especially the financial sector, that you might have a third of the members of Congress recusing themselves from these financial regulation bills if they were following a strict version of that recusal norm, if not law. But the Stock Act, I don't think requires anything unless it's a literal vote on something that will explicitly benefit the same corporation. And I'm not even certain of that. Before that, there wasn't much. But Jordan has done some work on the bureaucratic side with this, where there are more explicit recusal rules.
Yeah, and also the more explicit recusal requirements, and both in federal courts and federal bureaucracy, are also coupled, I think, with more obvious and more sort of robust enforcement mechanisms, which leads me to wonder sort of who's out there watching members of Congress to see that the stuff is, I mean, now I think it's a little bit more publicly visible, but maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I don't really know who they were relying on. But I mean, federal judges, you have judges from circuit courts of appeal that are actually forced off the bench due to deciding a case because they had an underlying financial interest in. But I don't know if it works the same or.
Although you found in your dissertation, you found that members of the NLRB did not recuse themselves.
Right.
So it might be nice on this Congress paper, regardless of what the rules are, maybe to create a list. Sort of, here's how frequently members of Congress own specific stocks and perhaps should have recused themselves based on a strong reading of what is now the Stock Act, and just see who actually did recuse relative to who should have based on a objective reading of their Stock Act.
Yeah.
Quick question. How do you, this is a measurement issue, I'm sorry for jumping ahead, but it's relevant here given this discussion we're having. On the idea of how you measure if I own an individual stock or not, I happen to own all index funds. So I own a lot of these stocks. I'm sure I probably own a lot of Apple and a lot of other things that I'm not aware of because I just buy the index fund. And so I'm guessing there are members of Congress who have the same issue that have bought, Vanguard index funds. And how is that coded? Maybe it's in the paper and I missed it, but
yeah, that's the question. That was coded as we don't code that as having an underlying holding.
No, we didn't unpack the fund holdings.
So they only own Citi or GM stock or Ford stock if it's the actual stock holding that they're purchased individually, not a broader index. And then on the index funds in general, they're included in the overall measures of risk aversion, but not on the individual stock measures. And one thing that's interesting, come up for professors who've read this, I think we might be a risk-averse group, but the surprisingly large numbers of members of Congress don't have large holdings in index funds. And a lot of them do, but compared to the general population, they have a lot more holdings in individual stocks.
Okay. Let's open up this discussion to the theory sections of the paper, and of course we can continue to talk about framing issues as they're relevant. But if you guys have specific theory comments, let's get to those. Anybody want to jump in to start that?
Sure. On the risk aversion thing, I think there's a distinction. Well, I guess this is a question. Is risk aversion kind of domain specific? In other words, people that are risk takers, and members of Congress are, of course, just more likely to be risk takers, like you just said. But are people that are risk takers in all domains, or is it just you're a risk taker if you have a lot of financial holdings and you know you can vote for the government to bail out these companies? So I think if it's a broad kind of personality factor that you're wanting to test, in order to tease out the difference between personal financial interest and propensity to take risks, I'd try to get a measure of risk-taking behavior that is not related to financial holdings. So, I mean, something that I just thought of would be whether they challenged an incumbent either when they ran for Congress or maybe when they had a previous office or something like that. I mean, that's easy to get data on. There was probably better measures, but you can think of some. But I think if you want to test this idea of just general risk aversion, I think a broader measure of risk aversion that's not correlated with financial holdings would allow you to tease those out better.
Right, so I think something we thought about before, and that I think is an idea that I really like of using other sorts of political decisions that they could have made outside of the policy realm, just because, you know, you're faced, if you're trying to measure and gauge who's risk accepting versus not, you're wondering what is a risky decision for these people. And I think the problem with a lot of the policy decisions, especially the ones maybe outside the financial realm, is that there's a lot of post hoc judgment into classifying something as either a risky decision or not. You know, I think it's easy to say that something was risky if it had negative consequences. So I think something like a campaign decision to challenge an incumbent is a little bit better, a more reliable metric for who is willing to take on personal risks, you know, not unrelated to their finances, but not directly related to their finances in the way that these policy decisions work.
Yeah, and if anyone has any other ideas for other measures, that's a great one.
Sort of picking up on that suggestion, I wonder if you could look at, for the first time that they ran for Congress, were they running for a safe seat for their party, or a seat that leans the direction of their party, or a seat that leaned in the direction of the other party? Give you like a few more cases, a little bit more variation than the incumbent stuff. Though I really like the incumbent measure a lot. So you could use like the CQ race ratings or Cook or any of those to then classify how ambitious they were, I guess, in their run for the seat.
Yeah, that's it echoes the Brody 1979 article on risk aversion.
Right. Yeah.
Those various measures. And I don't know. I mean, so in this paper, we did struggle theoretically. Is this about financial risk aversion? Because the policy that we care about is financial regulation, theoretically, but also theory could be broader. Theory could just be about risk aversion in general, not in public policy. Tell us what you find more persuasive before we collect additional measures. Is it just about financial risk aversion, and we can leave it at that in the current paper, or do you find this to be a broader question of risk aversion? But I think it's a little more on just the financial side at this point, but I'm not sure.
I think it could go either way, really. But if you're interested in just risk aversion, then I would also think foreign policy would be obviously something you'd want to look at, because, you know, whether we're going to intervene militarily in the Middle East and stuff like that, you would think risk aversion, if that's a thing that matters, would influence that kind of decision. But I like your paper and your focus on the financial stuff right now, too. So.
Ellie or Jason?
I have some thoughts on more on the measurement side of the risk question of sort of, I guess I'll hold them until we get to the sort of more empirical section. But
I have one.
Couple. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Jason.
I do think, I mean, echoing probably what Chris is saying, that the theory is a little underdeveloped. It's not clear to me the connection between personal gain, risk aversion, and risk acceptance and how I'm going to vote there. I mean, the way I see this as a member of Congress setting these rules is that you have the opportunity to pick winners and losers. And that can happen in a lot of ways, right? I mean, this in some ways hints at measurement, but you sort of make a simplistic argument that if I have a lot of stocks, I'm going to want to help the stock market. Maybe, but as I was reading through the City and Travelers example, I'm thinking about this. If I'm sitting there as like a risk acceptant member seeing this coming down the pike, you say people are expecting this thing to happen, I would have been shorting the hell out of those stocks and then trying to sink the thing. You really want to make money. I mean, that would be the risk acceptance strategy, is I'm going to filibuster this bill, keep it from passing. Those stocks are going to tank, and I've shorted them, and now I've got a windfall. Furthermore, And then if you are so risk acceptant, it was unclear to me how that connects to voting for the bailout. It seems to me that on the bailout, what you had was people who were fearing that the entire financial system was going to collapse, and that they decided to bail it out rather than run the risk of it collapsing. As if I'm really a risk acceptant member and I have a lot of stocks, I can probably see who may come out ahead, who may come out behind if shit continues to hit the fan. So maybe I want it. Why do I want to bail it out? Maybe I want things to continue to unravel, and I can profit from that.
I guess part of what we were trying to get at in terms of thinking about what a risky member of Congress might do, risk accepting member of Congress might do versus the more risk averse one in terms of the bailout was taking into account, and it was a while ago, and we don't have really great data in terms of what the mood was at the time, but it was accounting for the uncertainty involved in the situation, and we actually did inject all of this cash into whether it was loans being extended to the auto industry, bailouts for the financial industry, and the risk maybe having to do more with the uncertainty about whether or not these broad extensions of capital would actually succeed in fixing the problem or not.
Yeah, but I do see. I agree. I was thinking of it similar to what Jordan was saying. The broader risk to the economy that the government is taking on by passing these bills, but then there's a tension that we have to work on individual risk. I don't think a lot of members are short of anything. There's a few, but not very many. But yes, there might be some individual risk acceptance that would imply certain behavior that may not map on to the broader aggregate risk embedded in some of the bills. That we should probably think of. I do think there's generally, instead of thinking about it from a risk acceptance standpoint, the legislators who are most risk averse financially, the ones who want to keep their money in cash, the ones who have their money in cash, it is not in their interest to have bailout because they're already in, unless they're moving the cash over to stocks at that point. And so from that perspective, I think it's their personal interest.
Well, there's two ways of thinking about that. If I'm sitting in cash and the market's tanking because the first bailout failed, right? So the first bailout that happens, where I was when it happened, and you just see the Dow tumbling, rolling downhill. I'm sitting in a lot of cash money. Keep going, because then I'm gonna jump in later. I wonder what's tripping me up is the use of the term risk. I wonder if you couldn't conceive of this better as exposure. Is really what you're talking about. Those are two different things, but you're measuring. I think you're doing a better job of measuring exposure than you are risk. And I wonder if people like me won't get as upset if you're saying exposure.
Yeah, no, I see. Because right. I mean, if you are, I guess there's two predictions. So if it's really risk aversion, you're sitting on lots of cash, which is a type of measure in some ways, but is in the risk aversion measure. There aren't that many people that are 100% cash, just hypothetically. You might want the stock market to continue crashing in LA, like you were saying, but then at some point you would have to buy, and it'd be a pretty risk-oriented strategy to put all of your cash in the stocks in 2008. If you're a risk-averse person, you'd probably be running around really nervous, freaking out, wanting to put your other 5% of holdings that aren't cash, and then you have 95% cash or something like that. So there is a risk-accepting person might behave differently in LA than a risk-averse person would in terms of the change in their investments, and we don't look at change in investments, and so maybe that change variable in measurement might separate out exposure versus risk. Or maybe it's just exposure.
So sort of relatedly, one of the things that I guess for me the big picture concern for the theory is about an unnatural conflation of I guess what it is that it's aversion and personal financial interests seem more similar than they are theoretically. So when you're talking about personal financial interests, just think through what the steps are theoretically, right? You're really talking about I'm a member of Congress and I'm looking at my own stock portfolio and I'm saying, how will my behavior, meaning my actual votes cast, affect some set of outcomes that will eventually circle back and affect the actual value, my personal financial interest? So the theory is about this, it's sort of this private interest thing. It's I have this, I want to try to do whatever I can with my behavior to try to increase my personal wealth. Your discussion of risk aversion is couched not in terms of am I risk averse about how my decisions might affect my own personal portfolio. That's about how my risk acceptance or aversion affects my attitudes about financial policy, right? So from a theoretical standpoint, those are, to me, much more different than they're currently pitched, right? The second is, I think, as Chris was sort of mentioning, I mean, that's, both the way we think about measuring that and the ways that affects our own behavior might apply to tons of different policy areas, right? There's risk aversion and acceptance in every policy decision, regardless of whether it's financial. Whereas if we're talking about risk aversion and acceptance as it applies to decisions I make about my own personal wealth, it's much more in line with the sort of theoretical premises that I have to lay out in order to get the sort of predictions I get for my own interests. So I guess it seems like there's a sense in which you really have two totally different theories here that only look similar because you end up measuring them both with using financial data, right? Or personal financial data that in fact aren't the same theory at all. So I might push you to figure out how to, create a more unified and more unified and parsimonious theory by focusing in on one or the other sort of chains of logic, and then relegating some of it to just being theory of measurement, right? Because you could very easily still be interested in some of the risk aversion stuff to test hypotheses that were just about personal financial interest, or vice versa, right? If you want to have a theory about the way that legislators make decisions out of risk aversion or acceptance, you might use the financial data as a measure, right? But it may not really be about financial stuff at all, the theory. So I guess that just seems like a point of tension to me, that this isn't really one theory.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's echoed everyone else's comments. I think we should work on the risk aversion side to focus on the individual foundations of the decision making regarding legislators' risk more than we do in the candidate and more accurate risk to the economy embedded in this policy.
Yeah, I think if you focus on just the personal financial, and I like the word exposure that Jason used, if you just focus on that for these financial votes, that strikes me as enough to have a pretty good publication if you nail the empirics and really build that theory up a little bit more and frame it a little bit better in that literature about personal factors influencing congressional decision making. And then the risk aversion piece is also very interesting, but again, I agree with others in that would affect all sorts of policy, environmental regulation, military intervention, you name it.
Yeah, so risk aversion as a separate paper could be useful applied to multiple policy areas.
And one thing I was thinking is, in terms of risk aversion, if we want to go that route, do risk-averse members self-select into one party or the other? I guess when I think about economic stuff, I would think if you're risk-averse, you would probably be a Democrat because you want more regulation. I mean, yeah, it will maybe stifle growth and innovation a little bit, but things will be somewhat more predictable. So I wonder if there's that going on with members of Congress self-selecting into different parties based on their risk aversion.
All right, let's move on and open it up now to some conversation about measurement. This can sort of include measurement and research design and empirics. I think we just sort of talk about at this point the back half of the paper. So anyone that wants to jump in, Ellie, I know you had some measurement comments, so if you want to go first, it's all yours.
Yeah, sure. So I was interested, and we sort of hinted at this a little bit earlier about, in particular, looking at whether or not members engage in any financial transactions between the bailout votes. So you must, I think, in the financial data you get the transaction dates in there, but so it seems like you have the data to test sort of Jason's theory about whether anyone's shorting the market or not, and to like look at how active members are in terms of financial transactions in that window, or just before the window, or just after the window. It seems like you could do more to exploit the additional data that you have on the subject. And then sort of relatedly thinking about, this is sort of both in terms of risk aversion stuff, but also in terms of like investment strategy. You might want to think about the member's age in relation to their investment strategy, right? All the like simple financial advice talks about how you should be really risky when you're young, and so the like 32-year-old Congress member should be investing differently than the 99-year-old Congress member or the 78-year-old Congress member, and sort of like like naturally the investment advice would be different. And so I don't know, you could obviously model that. It's easy to get the member's age and sort of take something of that more explicitly into account. The other sort of measurement thoughts that I have, at one point in the paper you assert sort of, well, members are wealthy, and so like they're all pretty wealthy, and so we don't need to worry that risk acceptance is picking up sort of other sorts of financial characteristics, but there is still a fair bit of variation in the financial holdings of these members, and so it's pretty different to if you have an asset portfolio of $80 million and you hold 1% of it in cash, like you're pretty good, right? That with your government income, like that's in some ways a pretty safe strategy. Even if you invest all the rest pretty irresponsibly, like you're not going to be out in the street, you're going to be doing pretty okay. But that's pretty different than the members who are at the low end of the spectrum and only have $100,000 in savings, and that's their entire asset portfolio. And if they do something with that 90%, I don't know exactly how you incorporate that in your model, but there's some sort of like baseline wealth. It seems like risk means different things at these different wealth points. And so to the extent that you have members who are in sort of wildly different wealth bracket areas, it seems like trying to incorporate that into how you think about whether or not they're investing in a risky way would be useful.
Okay. Jason? You're muted, Jason.
Didn't hear you.
Still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, gotcha.
I can't reiterate enough what Ellie said about age. That was the thing I wrote on just about every page of this paper. You can't assess how risky a member's portfolio is without considering their age. Like Ellie said, if they're 30 years old, they're mostly invested in equities. That's a perfectly reasonable investment strategy. If you're 90 years old, or however old some of these people are, and you're all in equities, that is not a conservative financial portfolio. Furthermore, then, it was unclear to me why you weighted the things the way you did in constructing your measure. Why is it 2 times bonds, 3 times cash? Adding onto that, what kinds of bonds? I mean, there's a big difference between investing in junk bonds and U.S. Treasuries. Do we have any information about what kind of bond holdings? Are they short-term? Are they long-term? What's the grading on them? I mean, bonds. Just saying bonds are safe is not. I think that is very heavily dependent on what kind of bond you're holding. And then I would also reiterate Ellie's comment on if you have any idea about the activity level of the members. Are they trading a lot? Is there a lot of velocity? And someone who thinks that they are who trades a lot is probably someone who's more risk acceptant than someone whose strategies I'm going to buy blue chip stocks and hold them until I retire. I think that's a different kind of person than someone who is actively juggling their portfolio regularly.
Yeah, those were the 2 points that I was going to make as well about age. The simple way is just do some sort of age-adjusted explanatory variable, if you want to just keep things simple. The good news is that's kind of an exogenous instrument for their strategy, their investment strategy. The other thing was also the weighting. It seemed arbitrary to me, and you didn't have any explanation of why you did the 3, 2, 1 in the paper. So maybe that makes perfect sense. but it wasn't clear to me. I wonder if there's not a measure in the financial literature, some composite measure of risk or exposure or something like that that you could look into. I have no idea, but there may be. Those were the two things that jumped out at me. One other thing was, in terms of measuring their financial interests, like you look in the 99 and 2000 votes at whether they have Citigroup and Traveler stocks, but those bills would have been predicted to grow the financial sector, so even if you had a lot of financial sector stocks that weren't those two companies, you could expect to benefit, potentially. And then with the auto stuff, I'm not sure how the bailouts would have affected other auto manufacturers. I could see it going the other way. So if you had stock in Toyota and Honda and VW and they go under, that might be good for you, right? On the other hand, if the auto sector is just in free fall, that might be bad for you. I don't know, but it would just be interesting to look and see.
Yeah, those are all good suggestions. On the measure, we did spend some time on that measure of risk aversion. So we try to avoid putting on judgments about what is or is not risky post-op. The finance literature just focuses on the ideal would be a diversified portfolio with a number of stocks, some bond holdings. Theoretically, it doesn't specify which bonds, but presuming with somewhat safer bonds would be risk, and then some cash. But we could go and look at some other measures beyond what we do. Part of it was just the data are so massive that identifying what's a good bond, bad bond isn't a good answer on the bonds one, but we talked to some finance professors. They're like, yeah, bonds are kind of risky, but they're not as risky as stocks. But that we need more justification. Personal communication with finance professors.
What about some sort of concentration measure, like how spread out the dollars are across these various asset categories? There's a lot of different ways to measure how concentrated things are. That might be a way to go.
You could also just play around a little bit with the weighting formulas you use and show sort of how robust your findings are with different weighting strategies. So just to make us feel better, it's not being driven by these somewhat, obviously, which sort of have to be somewhat arbitrary allocation weighting formulas. Just play with the different weights, rerun them. If things show up the same direction, we'll start to feel better that it's not just the particular version of one.
Yeah, we could look at just stocks, right? Diversification within stocks is one measure, and then the percentage of bonds relative to stocks, and then just percentage of cash in general, not considering where the other investments are.
You'll probably find ideal portfolios out there, by Schwab or Vanguard or something. They will tell you, if you're this old and you consider yourself risk accepting, conservative, blah blah blah. They will give you ideal allocations of stocks, bonds, cash, etc. You compare what members are doing into those baselines, and say, this person's 2 standard deviations above what the recommended allocation is for their age, if they're conservative or if they're aggressive. And then that's more of a real, it's an exogenous measure of riskiness. I mean, Vanguard's not doing this for members, so.
Right. Yeah, the rules of thumb on how risky to be when you're given your risk.
You could similarly take advantage of those financial rules of thumb with the sort of recommended volume of or amount of investments for the person's age, like how much money should you have invested to be able to retire at X age, with maintaining your current level of income, so your current congressional salary. You could put some numbers in there for assumptions and then sort of back out how much they should have in savings. And for members who are above that threshold, they're pretty good, and so maybe, I don't know, that's sort of one form of risk versus not risk, of how fiscally responsible they are or how well set up they are for retirement. I mean, these things applied to Congress are all sort of weird because members of Congress retire at ridiculously old ages, and the general rules of thumb are problematic for a variety of reasons, but you could provide those baselines.
I was just going to raise that and just see what you all. I mean, so everything you're saying, I agree with on the more robust measures. But I'm also curious about our case is not the typical investor because they are in for life for the most part, right? There are exceptions. It's a pretty safe career. They, yeah, we can argue about it. I guess it's not as safe as it used to be, but you know, when you're elected, chances are you can stay for most people as long as you want. So what kind of difference in investment strategies might a member of Congress make that a regular person would?
So what I was wondering, I mean, we're basically talking about entirely about selection, you know, ways for members to reveal themselves to you as risk averse or not. Right? What we really like is if we could have something more exogenous. And I wondered whether or not you might get some leverage on whether you're vested or not. So, like, how long do you have to serve? What, 6 terms before you're vested in the congressional retirement? Mm-hmm. Right. So think about like tiers of people who are exogenously more financially stable into retirement. Right. Like the least stable person who will rely the most on private sort of retirement is a first-term congressman who got elected in a close district, right? Now, I haven't thought this all the way through, but there are sort of like, I mean, there's maybe something like a regression discontinuity, I guess, or some, you know, so like, you know, what are there differences between members who are like, you know, just on one side or the other of that 6-year vestment? Right, because even though most people, we say, and even they can look from an aggregate standpoint, right, like most members stay as long as they want, but you know, as we know, right, congressmen are always running scared. They always think they're going to lose the next time, right? So, you know, if I'm a, you know, maybe try some analyses where you look at members in their 5th term and members in their 6th term, and see whether or not you can get any kind of leverage on that discontinuity where members act more risk averse when they are in their 5th term, right? Where that, you know, versus in their 6th, where they're, you know, playing the house's money a little bit, right? I mean, they're already going to have a lifetime pension. It's really good. So I'm not, you know, I don't know, I'm not saying, you know, but just it's another design that gets you around some of the weird selection problems you have, and allows you to sort of have at least some measure of exogenous risk reason for risk acceptance or risk aversion.
Right. I like all those suggestions. Also, kind of drawing from a moment ago too, there are other data out there that we don't have incorporated yet, but that would also be useful. You know, one that we all talked about is looking at different sorts of transactions that they've engaged in. But we also have data, and you know, that sort of create different work or new work. But we have data on their debts also. You know, that's something that isn't in the news a lot with a lot of these, especially more people who've gotten into Congress more recently, like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, are in the news a lot, right, for different sorts of debts and loans that they've taken. So I think that is maybe something that could be incorporated either in future work or into this to think about what sorts of financial decisions they're making and to what extent does actually bear on their risk acceptance or not.
Yeah, or this is an exceptional case, so I'm hesitant to mention it, but I want to know also using Blake Farrell from Texas had tens of thousands of credit card debt in his financial holdings, which he was an outlier, but there are other data we're not using. But that's exceptional. That's unbelievable.
I guess one of the things we haven't talked about that I guess is unusual about members of Congress is that their financial exit options often potentially involve more money than they're currently making. So I don't know exactly what to do with that suggestion, but particularly members who had powerful positions, committee chairmanships, party leaders, they can all make, I mean, the data has borne this out. There have been a bunch of studies recently showing how much more money those positions in particular command after leaving office. And so, again, that's sort of an unusual wrinkle to throw into the traditional financial risk acceptance dynamics where you can easily make more post-retirement, so to speak, than you could before. Picking up on Nate's suggestion, which I really like, of exploiting that six-term discontinuity, I wonder if there are other discontinuities you should look at about the sort of revolving door bans and other things of like you know, all those members like Trump who jumped ship to avoid being caught up in the ban.
Yep, that's a good idea.
Yeah, that is good. Or also maybe the rules, people who the executive branch, the rules are stricter, may have, they still have to report their assets as well. Not in this paper, but that's something.
I had one other empirical thought that I guess we haven't talked about, and I was curious about what other people thought about the sort of party blame dynamics, and the sort of partisan dynamics at the time of these different votes. Like I think in particular about like the bailout and TARP. I mean, those were complicated partisan blame stories with, you know, Republicans controlling the presidency and the sort of timing of the presidential election, and you know whether Bush or the Republicans were being blamed for this stuff, and you were getting these weird split votes in favor of this, with both Republicans and Democrats, and the Bush administration helping to bring pressure to vote for this in combination with the Democrats, sort of people crossing ideological and party lines because of the partisan blame game surrounding the presidency and sort of who owned the status of the economy. It seems like minimally, it might be worth devoting a little bit more space in the paper to talk about those sorts of somewhat nuanced implications, and how, you know, you talked a little bit about the sort of people who switched and voted differently in these different times, but the partisan blame dynamics were different during these different periods, and so, I don't know, thinking through those dynamics a little bit more might be worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you may want to consider including a much larger number of roll call votes to kind of get around these, well, these were exceptional and we can explain it away by this. So there's been a lot of votes, obviously, on deregulating the financial sector over the last 30 years or so, and then maybe re-regulating it post-2008. So you might want to think about including a lot more of those votes. And of course, the more votes you have, the more appealing this is probably going to be to reviewers, I would think.
Yeah, so we have the financial data have been collected from 99 to 12,
Okay.
and so I'm not excited about going before 99.
No.
It's not easy. Because of, but we've got a lot of data, so any ideas on any roll call with financial relation we made over the 99 to the present period would be great.
I do agree with Chris on that. It was odd you were cherry picking roll calls. You said, you know, we wanted the last one before action or something. I mean, there are other votes there that may have been more directly at getting at something you're interested in. Was it the commodity futures? You said it got rolled up into an omnibus. It's really not telling.
That was the only vote. The only other vote.
Okay.
Because it's not ideal.
Okay.
But certainly look at the post-crisis, you know, creating the new financial regulations. Definitely look at those, because your argument is that it affects their willingness to regulate the financial sector. So.
Right. Yeah, we don't let the Dodd-Frank, if I recall, almost party line. So that's an issue. But there's a number of other votes that put that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, I wish it had had its own vote. It was blocked and then inserted at the last minute for the last vote of the current administration. And so a lot of things are going on in that bill. And then that's the one we found outside of the But we should make clear there are not other votes. I wish there were.
Okay. Other thoughts, guys, before we wrap up? Can we give any final sort of comments that didn't quite fit?
One little thing I had is for being on committees that would somehow indicate financial literacy. You know, are they on Ways and Means, are they on financial services, or are they someone who's, you know, I'm guessing there's a lot of heterogeneity in financial literacy in Congress, and one way to tap into that might be the kind of committees they're serving on, or even their background, right? If someone, I don't know, I'm thinking John Corzine obviously has a better idea of what's going on than some members do. Maybe not.
Blake Farenthold, for instance.
Yeah, well, like Chris's work shows that many people in business think differently, and that's relevant. We could expect differences, and I would guess wiser investment strategies in general in their portfolios for those with business backgrounds, but maybe not. Maybe members who are in business are risk takers who make crazy decisions when they get lucky, and are really wealthy, and they get lucky again, and they get lucky. And that's very
and some of the spousal holdings too, right? It's part of it. Like Nancy Pelosi's husband was in real estate right in the Bay Area, and they have a ton of random buildings around San Francisco. So that is included in there, but most of them, some of them will indicate, wife's possession, husband's possession, but not all of them do. So.
Might be worth trying to partition out the spousal holdings to the extent that you can, to sort of. You could also look at the, I don't know, econ majors or people with MBAs, and sort of other versions of personal financial literacy.
And then committee would be good. So do you think people who have, you think people with educational backgrounds in econ are more likely to have portfolios that are diversified or less diversified?
So I don't know, but it would help you tease out the difference between personal financial literacy and risk aversion, which is something that makes me a little bit nervous about some of the discussion in the paper of sort of how do you separate those things out, and it would be nice to have a sort of independent measure of the personal financial literacy.
I see, yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, so we could also, getting back to your suggestions on measurement, we could, there's a qualitative difference between owning stocks, but well diversified in stocks, between owning stocks and owning all, so, which, yes, that could be the literacy versus risk or exposure. I think majors, background, business
Anything else, guys?
So, can I ask one more question? People don't have any other time.
Sure.
So one thing that I found interesting from a data standpoint, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there that is, I'm not sure what to do with it, and I'm curious what, I mean, so for instance, I can't remember if you put this in the paper or not, somebody had lottery winnings or gambling winnings, and there are members of Congress seriously invested in that, things that do not make sense from a, to me do not make sense. Maybe I'm not that risk but the classic finance portfolio model, it's not good. And then we do have people who are varied in their real estate holdings versus bonds or stocks, types of stuff. Is there anything that you didn't have that in the paper, but if you're pursuing a broader project, might be interesting?
One of the broader data things that you mentioned earlier that I would think would be interesting to look at would be the, you mentioned that you have the debts in there too. I'd be curious to look at both student loan debt relative to college sort of education policy, student loan debt type policy issues, but similarly on credit card debt versus credit card policy, issues.
I mean, kind of the flip side or another angle of what you're doing might be debt tolerance, should we say. Like, so does personal debt tolerance translate into government debt tolerance? That would be a neat little paper. That would be easy enough to do if you have the data.
And you could construct an alternative version of financial risk or financial savvy based on some of the debt holdings as well. But like education debt, maybe at a low interest rate, and maybe a good idea. But as we all know, like any sort of credit card debt is pretty much a terrible idea. So like trying to incorporate some version of like financial savvy with the data that you have. Sort of, since you got this data, you could also look at sort of who chooses to invest in the district, in like district holdings, both in terms of land or companies that are based in the district. Similarly, you could do for congressional committees, who's investing in things related to the congressional committees, which you could either tell a self-interested story for, but you could also, like that could be their area of expertise, which is why they wanted to get on the committee in the first place. And so you could sort of try to tease out some of the sequencing on that based on when, you know, what their first financial disclosure form looked like relative to, I don't know, when they get the assignment and so forth.
The point Ellie made about the, you know, what their credit card and everything looks like, you do a fun little, it'd be a cute little blog post or something on, you know, how bad Marco Rubio is relative to everyone else with his financial decisions. You know, it's gotten a lot of coverage, but it's not really put in context of like, is this what members of Congress do? And I think the answer is no. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, everybody, I appreciate you guys coming out. Jordan and Christian, thanks for putting your paper up for discussion. Hopefully we got you some useful feedback and discussants. Thanks for participating in all your comments, and we'll sign off here until the next LSVW.